Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar entitled The Model Minority Myth, the Impact on Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the Legal Profession and Beyond. Today's webinar is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, as well as the ABA Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice and the American Bar Foundation. My name is Ajay Mehrotra. I'm the Executive Director and a Research Professor at the ABF and a Professor of Law at Northwestern. It's my great honor to be the host and moderator of today's webinar. Before I introduce our panelists, let me say a few words of thanks and about the format of today's webinar. First, let me thank all of the staff and leaders at the ABA, particularly the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, for all their help in organizing not only this event, but the series of events they've been doing to honor AAPI Heritage Month. I want to thank all of our panelists for making the time in their busy schedule to be with us today. As you'll soon see, we have a stellar group of thought leaders, not only about AAPI issues, but really on diversity matters writ large. And I think we're going to have a very exciting discussion today about the importance of diversity, not only in the legal profession, but in society. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for making time to join us today for this important and timely discussion. We all know there's no shortage of Zoom meetings and webinars on our schedules, so we appreciate you making the time to join us today. As I mentioned, and as you may already know, this panel is just really one of many in a series commemorating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. The ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section is actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please do visit their website for updates on these programs. A brief overview of the format. I'll introduce each of the panelists. They'll have some opening remarks with our first panelist, Justice Goodwin Liu, leading the way with a roughly 30-minute summary of recent empirical and interdisciplinary research situating Asian Americans in the legal profession. Justice Liu's presentation will be based on a path-breaking 2017 study, A Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law, conducted under the auspices of Yale Law School and NAPABA. He'll also discuss a follow-up project that he's been doing with us at the ABF on Portrait Project 2.0, and that'll help set the format and the platform for our subsequent panelists who will really discuss aspects of that study and their own experiences. As I said, we've got a terrific group of panelists. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A function. There is no chat function. This is a webinar. If you don't see the controls, you can just make sure your screen's not idle. Although we are actually taping this portion of the program, it'll be pre-recorded and then displays. Our panelists will be live at the end of this tape session to take on your questions and to have a more robust conversation. And we'll have a little conversation of our own among the panelists after each panelist has had a chance to actually have some opening remarks. And then finally, we'll be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who's registered so that you can share it more widely with your networks, which is what we encourage you to do. So with that, let me now introduce our incredible group of panelists who, as I say, are leaders not only in the AAPI legal community, but really thought leaders, I would argue, in diversity work across the board. I'll introduce them in the order and they'll be speaking, and I will have very short intros. These, as I say, these are some of the leading figures. I could spend all my time talking about all of their incredible accolades and achievements, so I'll keep it relatively short so that we can actually hear from them. Our first speaker will be the Honorable Goodwin Liu, who is an Associate Justice on the California Supreme Court. He was nominated by Governor Jerry Brown and sworn into office in 2011 and retained by the electorate in 2014. Before joining the state's highest court, Justice Liu was Professor of Law and Associate Dean at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. His primary areas of expertise are constitutional law, education law and policy, and diversity in the legal profession, as you'll see. Justice Liu, as I said, has been the leader of both the original Portrait Project as well as Portrait Project 2.0, really examining in depth the opportunities and challenges faced by Asian American lawyers. After Justice Liu presents some findings from the research, we'll hear from Ruthe Catolico Ashley, who's Executive Director Emeritus of California Law, and she helped create this organization to support California Law Pathway, which has as its mission to diversify California's legal profession through the educational pipeline. We'll talk a lot about the importance of pipelines for diversity. Ruthe is considered the diversity pipeline guru for the legal profession in California. I will add more than just California, I would say throughout the country. As a member of the State Bar of California's Board of Governors, she's chaired the Diversity Pipeline Task Force in 2007, which jump-started the pipeline work in that state. Before she was a lawyer, her first career was as a nurse, a nursing professor, something I did not know. Many talents on this panel. She became a lawyer after that and was a litigator for 15 years before returning to her alma mater as the Assistant Dean for Career Services. She was also the first the Division Chief Diversity Officer for CalPERS. After Ruthe, we'll hear from Wendy Shiba, who is a retired corporate attorney and business executive who has served as an executive officer of 3 New York Stock Exchange listed companies. She's been the executive vice president, general counsel, and secretary of well-known business such as KB Home. She was senior vice president, chief legal officer, and secretary of Poly1 Corporation, as well as vice president, secretary, and assistant general counsel of Bowater Incorporated. Earlier in her career, she was corporate chair of the City of Philadelphia Law Department, as well as a tenured associate professor of law at Temple University School of Law. And before that, in private practice with O'Melveny and Myers, and a law clerk to Justice Stanley Mosk on the Supreme Court of California. So you can see our 3 panelists really cover a wide, both breadth and depth of the legal profession, from the judiciary to the bar to the academy to the nonprofit sector. So we're really excited to have this panel together today for this very important discussion. With the introductions out of the way, let me now turn the screen and mic over to our first speaker, Justice Goodwin Liu.
Thank you, Ajay. Let me begin by saying thank you to the ABA for having this panel and the section on civil rights for their leadership in spotlighting these issues. I'm also very honored to be on this panel with Wendy and Ruthe, 2 giants in the area of diversity in the legal profession, and it's a great honor to be on this panel with both of them, and of course also with you, Ajay, my colleague and collaborator on much of the ongoing research we're doing on Asian Americans and diversity writ large in the legal profession. So thank you all. I'm going to share my screen and see if we can look at some slides. I'm going to go through this presentation very quickly because there's a lot of data to kind of get through. Okay, so what I'm going to do is present the findings of our original 2017 study called A Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law. And then somewhere around 15-20 minutes, I'll pivot to talk about some of our more recent research on enrollment trends in law schools and how diversity is shaping up there. And so that will round out the presentation that I have. This original study is available on the web link you see there. It was done with 5 authors, actually. 4 of them were students at that time at Yale. And we were very lucky to have Yale Law School be a major sponsor of the study, as well as the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. We had 4 basic components to the study. One was we tried to get our hands on anything that had been written about Asian Americans in the legal profession. Turns out not very much. We did a lot of data collection and some of our own original data collection through FOIA requests and other data series that had not been examined before. We did focus groups with several dozen attorneys at the NAPABA Convention in New Orleans in 2015. And we did the first ever national survey of Asian American lawyers. In the summer of 2016, we got over 600 respondents, which is a very, very good number. The basic story that we tell in the report is one of very rapid ascent of Asian Americans into the legal profession. So actually, if you were to extend this curve back another 10 years to 1990, you would see that the number of Asian American attorneys has increased from about 10,000 in 1990 to over 50,000, probably over 60,000 today. So that's about a 5- or 6-fold increase in one generation. That's very, very significant. And this is what has driven it, is that Asian Americans have been going to law school in very significant numbers. I think of this curve as having 3 parts. First, a very slow period of kind of gradual growth from the early 1970s. Starting, look at that number, it was practically zero in the early 70s, up through the mid 80s, slow growth. And then there's this period from the 80s to the mid 2000s where things just really took off. I went to law school right in the middle of that, actually, in 1995. And of course, I wasn't aware personally that I was part of some kind of trend, but now looking back on it, this is really quite remarkable. And then finally, at the very tail end, you see this decline. And the back half of my talk today is going to be about this picture, this last little bit about the decline. So we need to pay attention to that. We looked in our report at where Asian Americans and other groups are enrolled in law schools. So one thing we did was we separated all the different law schools into tiers, roughly 30 schools per tier based on their US News rankings. And those rankings, I'll just caveat by saying, are flawed in lots of different ways, but it was the most ubiquitous, sort of ubiquitously available tool we had for categorizing these schools in terms of their selectivity. And what you see is that Asian Americans do quite well in terms of getting themselves admitted to the top schools. So 10.6% of the enrollment at those top schools is Asian, and then it declines as you go down the tiers. Another way of looking at the very same data is to ask for each group, where are the members of that group enrolled in law school? So if you look at just tier 1 and tier 2 schools, you can count to more than 50% of all Asians in law school are in tier 1 or tier 2. And that's greater than any other group, including white students whose tier 1, tier 2 combined enrollment is less than 40%. Okay, so I think this is pretty much derivative of the fact that law schools admit very heavily on the LSAT, and Asian Americans do quite well on the LSAT. So the story that we tell in the report is, I've shown you the good news. I think what comes after that is a series of challenges in terms of Asian Americans reaching the top ranks of the legal profession and the prestigious positions. So here we see a curve about federal law clerks. What's most remarkable to me about this set of data, which is collected by NAUP, is that from 1993 to basically almost the present day, the curves for every group here are basically flat. There is not really a discernible increase in keeping with the increasing diversity, actually, of the students who have been going to law school. Another way to look at these data is to look at the gaps. So for example, we looked at the percentage of each group that graduated from the top 30 law schools on the theory that these are the schools that send most of the clerks into federal courts. And if you look, for example, at Asian Americans, there are roughly, I said 10.6%, they are roughly 10.6% of the graduates, they're about 6% of the federal clerks, and you see similar gaps for Black and Hispanic students as well. White students, according to these data, were less than 60% of the top 30 graduates, but more than 80% of the clerks. So these are big gaps, and a lot of what we're doing, that I'm doing with Ajay right now with ABF, is studying this particular picture, which is why is it that there are these gaps in the attainment of clerkships. So stay tuned for more on that later this year. How about law firms? Well, when you look at law firms, what you see is this picture. If you start at the far right, you see Asian Americans have penetrated law firms to a significant degree, almost 7%. If you look at actually entry-level hires or summer associate hires, they're even greater, somewhere around the 9, 10, 11, 12% range in many of the big firms. But as you get up higher into the executive positions and the important committees, you see that their numbers really dwindle. And one of the most stunning statistics that I think we encountered, I don't show it here in this graph, is that I believe our data showed that in 2014, more than 90% of the equity partners in the top 250 firms were white. And that's in the present day. And so this is, these are very significant skews, I think, in the composition, the demographics at the very, very top tiers. One reason for this is attrition. And that only makes sense because if you look at the entry-level demographics, they don't look anything like the top tier demographics in these firms. And Asians have the highest attrition rate among all groups by a big margin. Now, I'm going to suggest we should interpret this set of data with caution because it's important to ask, what do Asian attorneys leave to do? Obviously, if they're getting good opportunities, they're going in-house or going into government with opportunities that they desire, that can be good news. But if they are being pushed out or if they don't see a future for themselves in rising through the partner ranks, then that's obviously not great news. Either way, what we see is a very, very anemic percentage of Asian Americans at the very, very top of law firms, and that's true for African American and Hispanic attorneys as well. How about general counsel? Well, here's some data that go all the way through 2017. The bottom line here is that at the Fortune, I separate out into 500 and then 501 to 1,000, but basically among the 1,000 biggest companies, 32 Asian Americans serving in the top GC positions in these companies, and that's in 2017. That is, of course, an improvement from only 7 in 2004, but 3% of the Fortune 1000 is still a pretty low number. So one thing that is also noticeable in the data is Asian Americans in government and the small numbers there. 2 years after bar admission, Asian Americans, unlike all of the groups, have very low numbers, actually not so far from white, but in government. This actually reflects some data we have from after the JD study that the ABF has been continuing to do, that show that the motivations for Asian Americans to go to law school, government, politics, public policy ranks lower for Asian Americans than all the other groups. And that then shows up in these employment data 2 years later. Among AUSAs, assistant US attorneys, here's what we saw in 2013-14. Asian numbers about 5%. These are very coveted positions, of course, and the numbers are, modest at best. Here's the one that I thought most striking. In 2014, we got a database of attorneys, of prosecutors, elected prosecutors in America from a group called the Women's Donor Network. And they track the 2,400 plus elected prosecutors. These are the top DA positions and AG positions throughout the country, in county by county. Out of 2,400 plus positions, 95% are white. And we were wondering how many of them were Asian. Originally, their data had coded something on the order of 12 as Asian. We were so curious who these 12 individuals were in America that we then investigated the 12. And then we discovered that 8 of them were miscoded. There were a couple Lees who were not Asian American Lees, and other names that were mistaken to be Asian. And in the end, we were only able to confirm 4, not 4%, 4 Asian Americans among all the elected prosecutors in all of America. These data have been updated in 2019, and I believe that number has doubled to 8 out of 2,400, right? But that gives you a sense of, just think for a moment. It doesn't take a very diligent scan of the headlines to understand how much power the people who hold these positions have in America. And the idea that 95% of them are white, 8 of them today are Asian American, gives you a sense of who is at the table making important decisions. And then similarly, startling statistics, I think, for US attorneys. These are the Senate confirmed positions in the 94 districts throughout, federal districts throughout America. So we have a long way to go on some of these indicators. In terms of judges, actually Asian Americans have been making significant inroads. The number is, this is from 2016, the numbers actually has improved in the most recent administration and then under the Biden administration as well. So I haven't looked at the most recent number, but the trend line is definitely upward. Between President Trump and President Obama, the two of them put more Asian Americans on the federal bench than in all of United States history combined. In terms of state judges, the picture is likewise, very skewed in a certain way. Asian Americans have not made big inroads in terms of the state bench. At the time we looked at these data, out of 334 state high court justices, positions like the one I hold, 8 out of 334 were Asian American, 8. And 3 of them were on my court. So that leaves 5 for the rest of America. And then in 20 some odd states, there is not any Asian American on the state appellate bench, or maybe even in any state court period. How about academia? Well, here I think these graphs speak for themselves. Academia also has a very long way to go. When we asked our survey respondents about barriers to career advancement, here's what they told us. The top 2 things that they said were inadequate access to mentors and contacts and lack of formal leadership training programs. It was interesting to interpret these data alongside what we heard in the focus groups, which is to say that Asian Americans did not complain about not getting good assignments or not being able to do the work and these kinds of things. What they really worried about was that they were not part of the informal networks that really make for important relationships, that lead to sponsorship for partnership opportunities, that lead to client and business development opportunities, that they didn't have kind of a solid orientation to the unwritten rules of the workplace. And that's where people really felt that they didn't have the leadership training, and they didn't have the mentors and contacts that would enable them to advance. When we asked people how they were perceived, this is fascinating. This is one of my favorite graphs in the whole study. The implicit stereotypes sort of stand out. Asian Americans said that they were perceived as hardworking, responsible, logical, careful, quiet, introverted, passive, awkward. But they were not perceived as much as empathetic, creative, assertive, extroverted, aggressive, loud, and thank goodness we are not disorganized, right? So I think you can kind of map on your own, understanding of stereotypes onto these perceptions, and think about some of the built-in headwinds that Asian Americans face when they go into an organizational setting like a law firm. We asked our respondents about perceptions of overt discrimination. The good news here, although keep in mind, these data are now 5 years old. Okay, so a lot has happened in the world in 5 years, and we will be in the next year or so renewing this study, asking some of the same questions, and I'll be very, very interested to see if any of these data have changed. But most people said that they had rarely or never encountered overt discrimination. But when you ask people about implicit discrimination, the numbers do increase. So sometimes or often, more than 50% indicated sometimes or often they had encountered implicit discrimination. So this study was good in terms of putting some of the issues concerning Asian Americans on the map. We did get some significant media coverage to highlight some of these issues. And it's kind of interesting to see the latest round of media interest in the situation of Asian Americans writ large in our society. One of the most important things we tried to do in this study is to address the general invisibility of Asian Americans in discussions of diversity in America. And again, that's happening today in light of some very tragic events that are happening throughout our country. But it's happening against a baseline where Asian Americans are often not thought about when we're talking about diversity, and that needs to change. Let me pivot to talk now about our more recent work about law school enrollment. This is another wonderful collaboration with two other Yale Law students. And what we did in this study was we looked at two data sources, the primary one of which was the American Bar Association 509 reports, which law schools are required to file every year, that discloses a lot of data, including their demographics. And so we got comprehensive student data over a 20-year period. One thing that is important to keep in mind is the definitions that are used when reporting these data. So the ABA series reports non-resident aliens as a separate category. They're excluded from all the counts of the different demographic categories, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and such. So if you're basically an international student, you are automatically counted in a different column off the top. Secondly, there's maximum reporting of Hispanic students, which means that if you checked Hispanic, if a student checks Hispanic, that student is categorized as Hispanic only, and is not categorized as Black, Asian, white, or anything else, even though, of course, Hispanic is different from racial categorization. Hispanic is an ethnicity. So whoever checked Hispanic is counted as Hispanic, even if they check something else, which then, and then the third is that multiracial students are reported as a separate category. So this leads to some serious undercounting. If you checked Asian and white, like my kids would check, then you are counted not Asian and not white. You're counted as multiracial, two or more races. One thing that I just want to say is that demographers, people who are interested in these reporting rubrics, will very seriously and very soon have to think about how we are counting people, because what used to be sort of, you might even think of as sort of rounding errors, two or more races, that is the future of America. And if we don't figure out how we count these people, in a more granular way, we're going to lose a lot of nuance, basically, in how we see these pictures. Okay, the second set is from the Law School Admission Council. These are the folks who administer the LSAT. And very helpfully, they enabled us to get applicant admittee and matriculant data over a 20-year period. They count differently. They maximally report all races and ethnicities. So whatever you checked, if you check 3 boxes, you are counted 3 times in their data, which leads to other kinds of difficult perturbations in the data, because then you have more than 100%. They don't add up to 100%; they add up to more. That's okay. I mean, it gives you a different slice of how people reported themselves. They don't have a separate category of international student, but they have a category called foreign educated, which means if you got your BA abroad and came to US for law school, you're considered foreign educated. This is confounding slightly because some US students go abroad actually to earn their BA and then come back to the US for law school. They are counted as foreign educated, even though they are not foreign nationals. And then some foreign nationals earn their BA in America and then go on to law school here, even though they are foreign nationals, they're not considered foreign educated. So anyway, by and large, we try to use foreign educated as a rough proxy for foreign national. And then similar to the previous study, we developed a tier methodology so that we could look at distributional effects across law schools. And this was based on a 9-year US News ranking so that we could get a little more stability so that the rankings don't bounce around as much from year to year. So again, 5 tiers, and then we had a unranked 6th tier. All right, I'm going to move very quickly through these data because I'm almost out of time. But this is the basic picture over a 20-year period. The most important thing to realize is that law school enrollment has declined by about 25% off its peak around 10 years ago. This is, from all I can see in the data, almost like a permanent reset. Although there's been an uptick in more recent years, that uptick does not look anywhere close to robust enough to return those numbers to where they were 10 years ago, or even where they were 20 years ago. So the current number is off by 10% from where we were 20 years ago. So law schools have downsized. The gender picture is very interesting. In 2016, for the first time, women eclipsed men in number in law school, and that trend has only continued. Men actually have not significantly recovered in terms of the decline since 2010-11, whereas women have been going up. So this, it's far too early to be talking about the feminization of the legal profession. That's a very, very premature concept. But I think it's fair to say that the majority women composite of people going to law school looks like a durable trend for the foreseeable future. If you look at the distribution by gender in law school tier, however, you see something that should engender some concern. Women are more highly clustered in the lower tier schools. So if you look at the green graphs here, you see that the percentage of women increases as you go down the tier rankings. So one thing I haven't seen yet is a good study that looks at the bar passage rates and employment rates, which we know are affected by the tier rankings here. They tend to decrease as you go down the tiers. So how many women who go to law school actually end up in lawyer jobs, right? That's an important question that we need to ask in light of these distributional effects of where people go to school. And so despite you see the headline that more women than men going to law school, we don't yet know actually whether that has converted into more women becoming lawyers than men as a result. So that study has yet to be done. If you look at race and gender together, very interesting. I'll start with panel B here. I think I've long known, and many people in academia have long known, that Black women outnumber Black men quite significantly. And that's been a very steady trend for 20 years. You look at the pretty constant gap over that period. It's about a 70 to 80% gap. It's big. What I did not know is panel A. Among Asians, this is also true, that women have outnumbered men on a fairly constant basis across 20 years, and that gap is about a 30-40% gap. That was news to me. If you look at Hispanic, panel C, that's pretty interesting. Men and women kind of traveled together until the Great Recession of 2010-11. Men then flattened off, and Hispanic women have continued to increase. In fact, over this period, since the last decade, since the recession, Hispanic women have been the single most significant, sort of rise among all the different subgroup cutouts here. And no one has really, I think, taken a very close look at what's going on here. And I think that deserves a little more careful attention. And then finally, if you look at panel D, the white graph, what you see is that among whites, they're the only group for which men have consistently outnumbered women in law school, but women have caught up in the most recent years. Here's the aggregate figures for race and ethnicity. And so what you see here is that basically Asians and whites have followed roughly the same trend lines. Hispanics have increased actually since the recession in 2010-11. And again, I mentioned that's primarily driven by Hispanic women. And then African-Americans, you see, have had a somewhat modest, but not as steep decline as whites and Asians. So as a result of these trends, here's the summary. Today, law schools are more Black, more Hispanic in percentage, but the overall N, meaning the overall number of students in law school, is significantly lower. And here again are the tier effects. So you really have to look carefully across the tiers. Here's a single year snapshot, 2019. You see clustering of Black and Hispanic students towards the tier 4, tier 5, tier 6 schools. Here's a more dynamic version of that if you look across almost a 10-year period. Here's, this is kind of hard graph to read, but I'll just orient you really quickly. Here's the composite picture. The gray bars show you overall what happened. So overall what happened is that fewer students left the top tier schools, more students left the bottom tier schools. So you see tier 6, big negative drop, tier 1, less so. If you look at Asian students and white students, they follow the general trend. Smaller declines at the tier 1 schools, bigger declines at the tier 5, 6 schools. If you look at African-American students, it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Some of it follows a bit of the trend, but if you look at tier 5, for example, there's actually an increase and far less of a decrease in tier 6, and then Hispanic students sort of defy the overall trend line completely. If you look at tier 6, for example, what you see is not necessarily more Black and Hispanic students going to tier 6 schools. It's just that fewer of them have left in overall number, whereas, compared to Asians and whites, very, very big declines, 50 to 60% decline at those tier 6 schools, whereas the decline is only 20 to 30% among Black and Hispanics. So that's really what, explains the overall picture that we see today. All right, I'm going to conclude with just a few more slides here. The one thing I want to call attention to is that the biggest percentage decline off of the Great Recession has occurred among Asians. This was confirmed by both data sets that we examined, and the percent change is very significant. If we projected outward from current trends, remember I showed you at the very beginning the rapid ascent of Asian American lawyers over the last generation. This is a continuation of that graph. And what it shows is that around 2030, 1 decade from now, that rapid ascent is going to end. And it's going to end as a direct result of Asian Americans leaving law school, meaning decline in enrollment in law school over the last decade. And if those trends persist for another decade, this is what we are going to see. The constant scenario assumes the same number of Asian Americans going to law school as they are today. Census-based growth is a slight, maybe 1% growth in that number from year over year. But regardless, what you see is a basic flatlining of the number of Asian Americans who are going to become lawyers. That's holding all else equal, meaning if we don't do any intervention, if we don't, double the funding for Ruthe's programs, this is what's going to happen. Okay, so this is the steady state. We were curious why it is that Asian Americans have been less interested in law school or not enrolling. Not really sure, except that if you look at some of these survey data that AALS gathered, this is the percentage of undergraduates considering various advanced degrees. Look at Asians. They're pretty consistent with all other groups in all the different degree categories, except the JD. They are noticeably less interested than other groups. And this is one clue that I would love to explore more, and I'm really interested in what Ruthe and Wendy have to say about this. Asians report, this is the question, when did you first consider going to law school? This is a sample of about 7,000 law students that ALS did. During high school earlier, far less common than for other groups, and after college, far more common than for other groups. So in other words, Asian Americans come to law later. This is autobiographically my own story. I did not think of law school at all, actually, when I was in high school earlier, or even during college. Just a product of limited horizons, immigrant family, didn't have any lawyers in my family, didn't know any lawyers. And only after college, that I think had some important mentors in my life who steered me in that direction, did I finally get around to applying to law school and then going. So this is worth, I think, a little more exploration. Finally, non-resident aliens. This is probably affected by the pandemic in the last year or so, but you can see there's been a very significant increase, more so than people have realized actually in the JD program. We are commonly acquainted with the increase in the LLM programs, but in the JD programs as well, foreign students have comprised an increasing share. This is particularly true at the tier 1 schools, which have as many as 7 to 8% foreign national JD students today. That's a very significant number. And then last, here's the 2 or more races. That curve is only going to increase. And so we're going to have to think harder about how we are categorizing these students and counting them if we don't want an undercount with respect to all the different races and ethnicities represented. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to hearing my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Justice Liu. Ruthe, I believe you're next.
Thanks, Ajay, and thank you, Goodwin, for setting up this conversation. And what you talked about is actually just confirming and validating a life that I've lived for my last 30 years as a lawyer, and even before that. I'm the story of the typical immigrant family, one of the first wave of Asian Americans, probably the first wave of Filipinos that came. My parents came after World War II, came over on a ship, landed in Hawaii like many others have done, lived in Hawaii where I was born. So I am a naturally born American citizen, and then moved to California in the early 1950s, where I started school as a first grader in Glendale, California. When we moved there, we were the first brown family, not just Asian American family, but brown family, to actually buy real estate in the city of Glendale. And that was in 1955. And in 1956, another Filipino family who saw that we had been able to buy real estate in a very white community tried to buy a house a couple of blocks up the street. The neighbors found out about it and stopped that sale. I think the only way that my mother was able to get us through on a real estate deal was she had taken home-cooked lumpia and pancit to all the neighbors before we moved in and introduced herself as Victoria, coming in as their new neighbor, and she wanted to share some of her favorite food with them. So by the time we moved in, they were all her friends, which was her style of making friends before we actually moved in. Like you, Goodwin, who thought about becoming a lawyer? Asian parents want your kids to go into healthcare, to become doctors. That's the big thing. So I never heard about becoming a lawyer from anybody in my community, from any of my parents. They never thought that. And I started off in college as not even knowing a lawyer, not even thinking about becoming a lawyer, not doing anything about becoming a lawyer. And of course, what do Filipino women become? They become nurses. Of course. And there's a long history of Filipino nurses. And I became a nurse. And because that's what I was supposed to do. We did things that you were supposed to do, what your expectations were. And the expectation was not to become a lawyer. I didn't even know one at that time. The reason I became a lawyer was because I saw someone who looked like me, someone who was on TV, a woman of color, not an Asian American. But I was already a nursing professor, had been a nurse for 15 years, as Ajay said, and the Cosby Show happened beyond. Now you get to the law in all different kinds of ways. Mine was one of the weirdest, I'll have to admit. But my kids, I was already a mom with 2 kids, and they had seen the Cosby Show when it had started, and they'd loved the Cosby Show. And had said to me, Mom, you've got to watch the Cosby Show. You'll love the Cosby Show. Claire Huxtable is just like you. You're going to really like Claire Huxtable. I had no idea who Claire Huxtable was, but I did turn it on. And there was a 5-minute segment of that show where she is standing in the bedroom talking to Dr. Huxtable about a case she had in court. Incredible. I had never seen a woman of color before who was a lawyer. On top of that, she sounded like she had a double PhD in child psychology. She was a perfect mother. She was a perfect wife. She had a beautiful house, and she never cooked. You know, you see her going into the kitchen, if you'll go back to those old shows, she'll lift the lid and smell something, but she never cooked. And I thought, that's who I want to be. I want to be just like her, a woman of color who happens to be a lawyer. That's when I started law school. And on the day I turned 41, I graduated from law school. So it was a second, third, fourth career, whatever you want to call it. But then what you talked about, the lack of mentoring. So when I get out of law school in 1988, I'm looking around for somebody who looks like me, who can be my mentor, who can help me with the things that I need to be helped with, who can guide me, who can say, I understand where you're coming from. I saw no one. I looked around, and this is in California, of course, undoubtedly the most diverse state in the United States. And at that time, I'm looking around, and you know who I saw, Goodwin? You will just really, you'll really chuckle at this. The only person I could find at that time who looked and resembled me, and who was, in my eyes, had made the career ladder a success as a lawyer, was Justice Joyce Kennard. Now, Justice Kennard had just been appointed to the Supreme Court of California as the first Asian American justice for the Supreme Court. And I saw no one else. And so I called her. I had the wisdom and the courage to call her. And I said, Justice Kennard, I just graduated from law school. I see no one that really looks like me, except for you, that is in leadership. Will you have lunch with me? And I would really just like to pick your brain about what it's like to be an Asian American woman lawyer. And bless her heart, we met in San Francisco and had lunch. And I'll tell you, that was so frustrating because there wasn't anyone that I could see. Now, I'll have to admit that your boss, Chief Justice Tani Cantile, Sakaue, and I were at the DA's office in Sacramento together. She was a brand new DA, had not been able to find a job at that time, finally found a job as a woman of color lawyer at the Sacramento DA's office. And I happened to be an intern in Sacramento at the DA's office, and we saw each other in the elevator. We looked at each other and thought, oh my goodness, there's another one of us here in the DA's office. We need to know each other. And here, all these years later, here she is making a big difference and a big change. So when you talk about the things that you talk about, the lack of leadership, the lack of rising to the top, the lack of law firm equity partners, the lack of law clerks, that has all been so true. And that's something that I've struggled with my entire life as a lawyer. And I've looked around from the very beginning thinking, what is going on here? Why are we so lacking in visibility, lacking in leadership, lacking in the conversation about diversity? In Grutter, they never talked about us. They talked about Black and brown. I remember sitting in so many group discussions and classrooms and saying, excuse me, don't forget about the Asian Americans and the Pacific Islanders. We're here too. We are not where you think we are. We are not the stereotypes. We are not the minority. We're not up there. We don't have the leadership. We don't have the visibility. That is one of the reasons why my life's work for the last 20 years has been the diversity pipeline. I've got a few minutes to talk about the history of where the pipeline started. And I'll have to say kudos to those middle-aged white men lawyers who get it, because they're the ones who open the doors for the kind of work that I've been able to do and so many others in the work of diversity. Bill Paul was the president of the ABA in 2001. He started the very first pipeline council. It was called the Presidential Advisory Council on Diversity. I was so privileged to be asked to be part of that. And for the first time in my life, I heard the word pipeline that didn't mean gas and oil. At that time, the pipeline meant going back to law school, thinking that law school was where we got diversity. But it wasn't. After doing a little bit of research, we found that if you're not diverse in law school, you're not going to make it into the legal profession, but you don't get diversity in law school if you don't start at a younger age. I remember years of research working with Elizabeth Rinskoff Parker at McGeorge School of Law, where she started the first pipeline project with high schoolers, and finding out that the achievement gap is in 4th grade and we have to go as low as we can to get kids thinking about what they want to be. And the lower you go, the better. And trying to going to dinners and going to conferences and all those drive-by things that you do to try to change the world. And then finally coming in 2010 to a project that we now call California Law, opening our first high school law academies where we taught kids of color in very disadvantaged programs and in public schools about the law and law-related careers, and giving them a chance to see people like all of us on this screen to think, I can be that, I can do that, I can dream, and I've got a future if I want to. I can choose law. I can be something that I never thought about or that my parents never thought about. And we will talk about that pipeline more, but just to give you a little flavor of validating what you've talked about in numbers, what happens in real life really does happen. But little by little, we're changing it. All right, I'm done. On back to you, Ajay.
Thank you, Ruthe. Very useful. Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ajay. And I just want to say welcome to everybody. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with good friends and good colleagues. I wanted to begin, my experience as you've noted, has been I clerked, I was in big law, I was in academe, and then for more than half of my career, I was in the corporate arena. So I wanted to talk about how some of these issues play out in the workplace setting and what we can do to try to remove some of the barriers to advancement that were identified in the study. The study was groundbreaking, and I'm so glad that it's continuing with 2.0 and that we're revitalizing it so that it doesn't just sit on the shelf. Because in all these DEI discussions, I believe that it's really important to begin with facts and evidence so that we have a fact-based discussion that is not merely based on opinion or our own observations. So I want to thank you for presenting all the data. You know, I thought about how I personally am a part of the statistics that Justice Liu presented. So I was in law school in the 70s, and I've now learned that there were fewer than 2,000 AAPI students. I was part of that early wave. And then when I ultimately arrived as a general counsel of a Fortune 500 company, the last position from which I retired, I was one of, according to your data, Justice Liu, there were 7 of us in the early phases, divided between the Fortune 500 and the 501 to 1000. So that's when I was first entering the profession. As I said, I wanted to talk about how the model minority myth, which is the theme for today, has impacted. At the front end, I think there's some good news in terms of opportunities to enter the profession, but then the not so good news is what happens once we get into the profession. So there has been a resurgence of interest in the AAPI community. This is, after all, AAPI Heritage Month, but also the recent spate of hate crimes and violence. So you'll see a lot in the news today, and the kind of headlines that you shared. There was a recent article that I found on the model minority myth, and it talks about the fact that in the mid part of the 20th century, Asian immigrants and even American born, such as my parents, were really interested in assimilation, hard work, and playing along and integrating as the solutions to any inherent racism that they were experiencing. And so it's not becoming the model minority isn't something that was just thrust upon us. It's something that we collectively also helped to create. And in this article, it said, we helped to rebrand our own communities from being the yellow peril of the 20th century, and particularly World War II, to becoming model upstanding citizens. So my story is a little bit different from Goodwin's and Ruthe's in that my parents are American born. But despite being American born to my grandparents who were the immigrants, my parents were incarcerated during World War II as American citizens. And my siblings and I were born during and just after the war, and grew up in the Midwest in an all-white suburban community of Cleveland, Ohio, where, to Ruthie's point, we were not only the only Asian family, we were the only non-white family in the entire community. So I've got class pictures all through elementary school with very white bread looking children, and then the one little Asian face you can identify who happened to be me. So that was my experience. And I do think that assimilation and hard work were the prescription that my parents encouraged. So we were part of the issue, I think. We helped to create that myth and brand ourselves. Today, I think that the model minority myth has been weaponized. AAPIs are often used as the wedge and in discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a shame because it actually covers up the solidarity that exists between our community and other communities of color. And I think we're doing a lot to try to change that narrative today. So when we talk about Ruthe has the expertise in pipeline programs. I've also worked through the Just the Beginning Foundation on high school programs for underrepresented students interested in the law. I agree with Ruthe, we have to start early. And it was an interesting data point that high school students in our community are sort of underrepresented in their interest in law as a career versus medicine and the STEM areas. So I think that the Just the Beginning program, it's important to make certain that we look at all underrepresented communities. And here in Los Angeles, we do have a number of AAPI students who enroll in that summer legal institute for high school students. Getting into law school, as you've pointed out, seems to be less of an issue, although I want to be really careful that we don't homogenize our entire community, because while it's true that our community may have higher levels of educational achievement and economic achievement, it's not true across the board. And there are many segments of the AAPI community that have not enjoyed that kind of success. So it's really important not to really generalize across the board. But on the whole, the data will show that getting into law school is not such a big deal. And also first jobs out of law school, depending on the sector, also seem to be more available to AAPI students based on things like grade point average and that sort of thing. So when it comes to big law, years ago when NAPABA gave its first diversity symposium, this was around, I think, 2008, we had then fresh data that said that AAPIs were the highest minority group to be hired into big law positions, the most overrepresented as entry level, but had the lowest conversion rate to partnership compared to other diverse attorneys. And I think that the data you presented, Justice Liu, bears that out. So, you start to think about it, why is it so easy to get hired, but so difficult to advance and find success in the profession? And I think we've already talked about that. The stereotypes that you put out in that graph are very desirable when you're looking for entry-level people, right? You want people who are hardworking, right? Responsible, careful attention to detail. But then as we get farther along in our career, we find that those who are selected for advancement are those who are deemed to be assertive, having leadership qualities, being outspoken, and the like. And that's where the model minority myth and stereotype begins to work against us rather than in our favor. Along with the model minority myth, there's been a lot about implicit bias. It's not the primary subject of today, but there is plenty of research collected and out there. And I would encourage our viewers to think about how implicit bias plays into the model minority myth. And so when it comes to combating it, I go right back to where I began, data. Data is really important. So instead of talking about these sort of broad brush, really good worker bees, but not so great on leadership, we can begin to collect the data and say, well, is that really true? So some specific examples are that, during performance evaluations, implicit bias can sometimes play in, and you might hear a white male partner say, well, Associate X, again, good working, hardworking, lots of billable hours, but not really leadership material. So the bias interrupters that sponsors and mentors and management can use is to say, well, really, let's talk about that. Let's look at the number of projects on which Associate X has actually been team lead. That doesn't sound like a person who's lacking in leadership ability. So, bias interrupters can help explode the stereotypes and really begin to sort of push back and question why the person is regarded that way. I also think on the other side that the individual employees can take ownership of their career progression and work to try to combat some of the stereotypes. So I think my biggest piece of advice would be to get outside our comfort zone, right? So whether one is in a law firm or in a corporate legal department and a new project comes up, there might be something that you've done dozens of times and you've got it nailed. Don't volunteer for that project. Instead, put yourself out there and volunteer in an area where you haven't been tested or you haven't had a chance to showcase the particular skills you have. So I would say get outside the comfort zone, be proactive in volunteering, and be choiceful and intentional about volunteering. For a lot of diverse attorneys, and particularly women of color, face that intersectionality issue that's been studied. We tend to be the ones who are given sort of the social assignments, whether it's organizing something very informal, like a birthday party, right, for the office person, or something much bigger, such as a retreat. We are typically the ones who are expected to figure out the catering and figure out what the invitation font is going to look like. And I would encourage that we want to stray away from those types of assignments and think about ones that demonstrate leadership, strategic thinking, and put ourselves out there for that. It's too easy to get swallowed up in the softer types of assignments. Another thing that we can do is to think about proactively having a development plan. I can do that as an individual employee. I can do it as a supervisor or manager to identify high potential people who haven't yet been tested in these areas. And you know, in corporate America, in the HR world, we talk about PIPs, performance improvement plans, right? And a PIP is a very pejorative thing because typically person put on a PIP is experiencing some sort of negative performance feedback. And Ajay is nodding his head because you know all about PIPs. And I would suggest that to have a development plan is not only not pejorative, but it's a positive thing, right? That you have shown initiative to want to develop your skill set, and your supervisor or your manager has identified you as a high potential person. And you say, what is the gap in, you know, if you want to ascend to the next rung, whether it's partner or whether it's deputy general counsel in your organization, where are you currently and what are the gaps to getting you there? And then focus on trying to figure out the work assignments and the mentoring that can begin to fill in those gaps. So a development plan can be a very, very powerful tool. So those are we can talk about it more during the panel, but I do think it's important not only to use the data to recognize what our current situation is, but also to think about how we could begin to solve it. And I'm going to conclude, I think I have a little bit of time, with a couple of specific examples for me as the employee and for me as the manager. As an employee, I have often been the only. And in my corporate experience for my first 2 public companies, on the entire executive leadership team, I was the only woman and the only person of color. So me and all white men. I once remarked at a leadership retreat we were doing strategic planning. I once remarked to somebody I thought was sort of a kindred spirit and sympathetic. And I said, you know, it's really interesting that in that room, I felt simultaneously like sticking out like a sore thumb, but on the other hand, utterly invisible. How could those two things, how could they both be true? You know, I'm conspicuous and yet I'm invisible. Unfortunately, my well-meaning colleague had a response and he said, well, Wendy, you know, it's probably because we just think of you as one of the guys. So that sort of goes back to, you know, assimilation is the key to success. And I don't think he really perceived what a lonely experience it was for me to be that only. And as I progressed in corporate America, I found that the only people who really treated me differently and validated me were women on my company's board of directors. So ironically, even though I was the only woman in the C-suite, we did have women on our board of directors. And I found that the women directors not only perceived me differently, but treated me differently. And that was very valuable for me. It's really the only time in my entire career that I had any sort of sponsorship or mentoring coming from women. So that was really important. When I interviewed for a job where I'd gone through the whole drill and I was, you know, headhunted and they did a background check, after multiple days of interviewing with senior management, and, you know, it was sort of the final reference check before offering me the job, the CEO went back to the headhunter and said, you know, everything was great, but I just have one question. And the question was, is she tough enough? This was after 2 days of talking about the major acquisitions and mergers that I had negotiating with the Department of Justice to get through Hart-Scott-Rodino clearance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The final question was, is she tough enough? And they wanted the headhunter to go back and vet me against that single question. Now, when I was on the management side of it, at my one of my companies, which was a global company going through a lot of expansion, we were putting together a special team, and each manager was asked to identify one of their A players, not a B or a C player. We wanted the best and the brightest. So we put up a list on the whiteboard, and everybody thought, okay, this is great, we have our team. And I said, what's wrong with this list? And you can guess, right? The list was comprised of solely white men. Now, there weren't that many diverse people to choose from, male or female, in this particular company. But we did have one woman, happened to be white, but she was a woman, who was always complimented for her terrific work, she wasn't on the list. So I said, what about Cynthia? I've heard such great things about her. The response was, well, you know, she has young children. This team has to travel. They have to go to the, you know, and so we can't put her on the team. And I said, isn't that her decision to make? And people thought about it. And with that, her manager went to her, presented the opportunity. She conferred with her family and came back and said, between my husband and the two grandparents, sets of grandparents, they're going to work it out so that I can travel with the team. She went on the team. And I'm so happy to say that several years later, after I departed the company, she was elevated to a VP position. So that's an example of sponsorship. And it's an example of getting beyond the implicit bias and the stereotypes, thinking that a mother of young children could not possibly be put on this leadership team that would travel around the globe. So those are my examples, and I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Wendy, and the rest of the panelists. I think we've got about 15 minutes or so for a little bit of a panel discussion before we open it up to the live Q&A. And there's a lot to talk about here. I want to sort of break it up into pieces, because all of you have touched upon, using the metaphor, the pipeline, right? So there's the entry of AAPI and other diverse lawyers into the profession. There's the sort of key role that early career, law school early career plays. You've all talked about sponsorship and ally, and then there's the leadership role, how you elevate. So let's start at the front end of this. And you've all talked about different sort of pressures or factors. When you just mentioned the general pressure to assimilate, which often leads to, in a sense, a kind of invisibility. And Ruthe, you mentioned, and Justice Liu also, about the lack of role models or mentors that existed, as well as, Ruthe, you really touched upon something about the importance of pop culture, television, and the way it shapes our perceptions of what counts as a lawyer or who can be a lawyer. So I want to just throw out for the panel, what are, so you've identified a number of factors, but which ones do you think are the most important? Which ones truly shape the entry point of the pipeline for AAPI and other diverse lawyers? And I know Justice Liu, you've talked about this too, but Ruthe, please.
Yeah, let me take a quick gander at that, which is what I have found so important in our pipeline, which starts in 10th grade and goes all the way to law school. So as states, we're very unique in going in and talking to ninth graders to prepare them for 3 years in high school of 1 hour a day, every day, of a law class. And part of that is mentoring, and part of that is internships, and part of that is field trips to everywhere they can think of. But what has been most significant for our students, and I'd say our classrooms, are 60 to 80% students of color. 50% of them are on free or reduced lunch or are considered at-risk students, which is the exact population that we wanted to reach when we started this pathway. The most significant thing for them, not only has it been the educational classroom, but has been seeing people who look like them, who sat in the same chairs, who have the same kind of family background, who are now lawyers, who say to them, you can be what I can be. I have one of my first students at De Anza High School who graduated from high school in 2014. She is now a third-year law student at UCLA School of Law and will be graduating. She never thought about law until we had that law academy that opened up, and she was in the very first class, and she said, seeing mentors and forming relationships and working for a judge, that's what changed her mind about what she could be. They could see it, they could dream it, they could be it.
So Jay, I wanted to jump in. Ruthe talked about working for a judge. And one area that I wanted to touch on and didn't cover all is this interesting statistic about clerkships and the fact that, there's a disconnect between AAPI students getting clerkships. And one, I think, so this is farther on in the pipeline. This is, you're already in school, you've about to graduate, and how do you get into the clerkship pipeline? One of the best entrees is through faculty recommendations. So 3 of us, and actually Ruthe has taught as well, so we've all been on the faculty side of it. And in order to be recommended, I know areas where a judge or a DA will call a faculty member and say, I want you to send me your pick for this year. And that professor really has the ability to pretty much place their recommended person in that spot, or at least get them in for an interview. And so, who do the professors know? I think it's really important for students of color, and especially AAPI students, to begin to form those relationships. And I've mentored students to, sign up for one-on-ones during office hours, get to know their faculty members. I once was an advisor for an APALSA conference, and a student who attended was from Harvard Law School. The conference was at Penn in Philadelphia. She contacted me and asked if I would be a reference for her. And I said, well, I enjoyed spending 2 days with you, but I cannot be a faculty reference. I haven't been your professor. She told me that she had had more contact with me over the weekend than she had with any of her professors at Harvard Law School. And I said, you need to do something about that. And so I encouraged her to begin to get to know her professors. So I think that that's one of the main barriers for AAPI students getting into the clerkship pipeline. My clerkship was with Justice Stanley Mosk, and there's a special connection here because Justice Liu occupies the chambers that were Justice Mosk's. Justice Mosk plucked me out of obscurity as his first female and student of color to be his annual law clerk, because he was the visiting Chief Justice for our moot court competition. And I was a finalist, and I happened to win the moot court competition, playing against the stereotype that I could be assertive and give oral argument. And when the dean asked if he would ever consider a student from Temple, not a first-year law school, for his clerkship, he wrote back and said, I would be happy to interview the young lady who won the moot court competition. And that was the beginning of, that really changed my life. So I wanted, and you may have other thoughts, Justice Liu, you hire clerks. So what's the solution?
Well, Wendy, I'm sure you made him incredibly proud, and any judge who hired someone like you is exactly what they're trying, what they hope for the most is that it turns out just as well as it has turned out with you. I think that it's been wonderful to hear, and very penetrating to hear, the personal experiences that you, Wendy, and Ruthe have relayed. They've been echoed in countless voices every time we present, the Portrait Project data. Mm-hmm. The biggest piece of feedback that we get is that people can see themselves in the data, and even that recognition is such an important thing, because so often in these conversations, or when you're experiencing something in the workplace, you wonder, is it just me, or is someone, is this real, what I'm experiencing, or am I just imagining it? And so aggregating these experiences and putting it, into a report, making it a conversation starter, I think this is all hugely important in remedying the invisibility of these issues and encouraging more people actually to speak out about their personal experiences. So hopefully that can continue. I want to just say a word about where I think the big points of leverage are. And the media, I think, is a very, very big one. I'm old, I'm going to date myself, but I'm old enough to remember the days of the television show LA Law, and how LA Law drove a very large number of people to go to law school in the 80s. You can find newspaper articles about this. Of course, it's not scientifically proven, but it's part of the culture. And when something becomes popular and has been popularized and marketed, inadvertently, of course, but marketed in a certain way, you have to understand it has an effect on young people in terms of what they view as desirable, in terms of the imagery that they see. And this can be good or bad, of course, as we all know. Anybody, who has, spent some time thinking about implicit bias knows that this can be good or bad. I think that, that speaks to the very serious importance of, first of all, role models in the very, very top ranks and the visible ranks of the legal profession. It will be a game changer when we get to the day when there's a Asian American appointed to the US Supreme Court. I think that will happen someday, but you can imagine that's going to be a game changer for the Asian American community. And we've already seen it through other historic appointments to that court, and it's a very big deal. In the meantime, however, I think that when we're talking about movies, when we're talking about Hollywood, when we're talking about television shows, I don't know if we can even call them television shows anymore, but shows, I think that there's a very big role that can be played in terms of casting decisions, in terms of storylines, in terms of how people are represented in mass media. And I think some of the activity that's going on right now through the Asian American Fund and the activity that has been generated by the most recent spate of pandemic-related incidents, many of which I think we're all familiar with have been quite tragic, directed at Asian Americans, have really spurred an awakening by many people to try to do something to highlight these problems and change our cultural perceptions. So when I think about where the big levers are, I really think about media, entertainment, Hollywood, these kinds of places where, and even there, of course, the limited contacts that I've had in that arena speak to the very same problems, which is that Asian Americans are not at the table in the important decision-making roles on screen and off screen, where some of these stories, plots, casting decisions, are made. And so this is all one big web, right, of important changes that need to be made. But if I was thinking about, where the big leverage points are, I would seriously be thinking about media and entertainment.
Yeah, that's terrific. It's very helpful. And I just want to echo what Justice Liu said earlier, that when we try to address these challenges and opportunities, I think it's critically important that it's not just about statistics. It's about statistics and stories together that can actually be penetrating and can really resonate with people and make for change. And so I know we're almost out of time, but let me ask one other quick question on the other end of the pipeline, on the leadership run. So as you saw from Justice Liu's presentation of the original portrait project, especially among the AAPI community, there's a bottleneck that AAPIs are not making it to the top rung. And there is data, as Justice Liu pointed out, about attrition from law firms. And I think there's an open empirical question, and I'll just leave it to this as the last question for the panel, about whether that it's a push or pull factor, as Justice Liu suggested. Is it a bad news or good news story? Are AAPIs being forced out along the rung to leadership to equity partner, or are they being pulled into the GC office? And so what kind of story can we tell? We have to do a lot more research, but I think it'd be interesting to start with some general thoughts about the bottleneck issue. Why aren't there more AAPIs, not just at law firms and GCs, the academy, the nonprofit world, the public sectors, just as we point out? What do we think some of the causes of the bottleneck are?
So Ajay, I'll jump in on the push-pull. I was very interested in that description of it, because I agree that it's both. I think on the push, I think in law firms, especially in big law, AAPI associates are discouraged about their opportunities to advance first to non-equity and then ultimately to equity partnership, which is really, the ultimate arrival in big law. And to be told constantly that they lack either leadership ability or the ability to generate a book of business, I think is discouraging. So the work is great. Again, you're a great worker bee, but what does it take to make it to the next rung? So I have heard from a number of firm associates who are looking for an exit ramp because they don't see a bright future within the law firm, yet they have an important skill set and they want to know how best to deploy that skill set to the next phase of their career. And that leads to entry level within or mid-level positions in-house corporate positions, particularly when they have a sought after skill. IP is a great example of that. But on the pull factor, that they were pulled away from big law, now you have people who are top performers, either as associates or as partners, who are sought after by headhunters and leadership teams for the big, the brass ring, for the general counsel or deputy general counsel position. In that instance, I think the best and the brightest are being drawn away for these, these big opportunities. But that also highlights one of the issues in the article I referenced called The Workplace Penalty for Asian Americans, that oftentimes today searches have a DEI component, right? Because big, Fortune 500 companies have gotten smart about that. But sometimes in that discussion, Asian American Pacific Islanders are not even included when they're looking for a diverse slate of candidates. They're thinking about Black and Brown candidates, but they're not thinking about AAPI or disability or sexual orientation and gender identity, which for the ABA is the full spectrum of diversity under Goal 3. So those who are in a position to influence those kinds of searches have to be thinking about a more expansive view of what DEI really means within the organization. So I think there's both a push and a pull that is creating that bottleneck.
Let me go back to number 2 barrier that Justice Liu talked about. The first was mentoring, and the second was the lack of formal leadership training. And I just wanted to touch on that there is formal leadership training where you learn how to be a leader in a structured classroom or in a structured program. There's also so much informal leadership training. And I'm talking about bar associations and leadership in bar associations, so starting small and growing to maybe a local level, going to a statewide, going to a national level, and really honing your skills, not only as a leader, but as a communicator, and having people know the kind of person and the kind of leadership you have. I think that's hugely important. When I look at my career, that's really where I honed my skills as a leader, in bar associations and community groups, not as much in a job related situation, but I found as I honed my skills in leadership in volunteer and bar associations, it translated to leadership skills on the job. So I want to make sure that those who are listening don't just talk about leadership training in a formal way, but talk about leadership and learning leadership skills in other ways other than just saying, I'm going to a leadership training program. Second barrier that you cited, Justice Liu, wanted to talk about that.
Justice Liu, I think we can give you the last word here before we turn it over to Q&A.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that these are wonderful insights and very, very thoughtful discussion. I would only say that, the work that we still have to do includes many of these issues, because the one thing that we learned from our initial effort was how little actually has been done on this set of issues. Even what both of you have just discussed, the push-pull in terms of why people leave law firms, the availability or unavailability of leadership, both informal and formal support. I think this is still too much in the realm of anecdotal. We know this exists because we've heard it from so many people, but it needs to be put into a set of findings actually that's systematic. And so for those of you in the audience who are listening to this and want to think about how to contribute, there are many things that firms and other organizations can do to support systematic efforts to inquire. And I'm just going to say that unless you inquire, you're not really going to have a set of solutions for any of these things. If you relegate this set of issues to the realm of individuals who are just relaying personal observations, it will never get the kind of attention that's needed when an organization commits itself to studying a problem and actually coming up with an independent set of findings and then committing itself to do something about it. The basic business motto, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get managed, is true for diversity in spades. In many organizations that do not look, do not monitor, do not track, these issues are sidelined because there are always other priorities that take greater prominence. And so I would just encourage that idea is that we need to take this seriously, just as we take the bottom line very seriously, because this is part of the bottom line.
Right. Very good point. You can't move the needle, right, unless you've got a needle, right? measure things. So terrific. So I think at this point we will end the recording and start our Q&A.
Well, greetings, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you now live with our panelists, Wendy, Shiva, and Ruthe Ashley. Ajay Malhotra had to drop off and can't join us for this segment, but I see in the chat and in some of the comments, Q&As, there's a lively discussion about some of the points. I'm going to just begin by picking up on a few threads that I noted in the chat. The first is that there should be, and I apologize if there wasn't in the initial presentation, an acknowledgement of the real trailblazers who, when I showed that first graph of the almost zero in the 1970s, those of you who are part of that cohort really did pave the way for many others. And it's important to acknowledge that the almost zero was not really zero. And many of the important organizations that germinated during that period were the result of people laying that foundation for growth that happened many years later. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Let me just pick up on the point about law firms, and many of the folks on this are in firms, maybe Wendy, you can start us off. You've had experience in all these different sectors. What is the situation in law firms today in terms of advancement and prospects for advancement? Many associates come into firms knowing that the needle is already very narrow, regardless of who you are. The chance of making it all the way through, climbing to the very top rank of equity partner is already slim. For Asian Americans, in light of the challenges that have been identified, what should they be doing and what should they be thinking about?
Well, it's been a while since I've worked in big law, although I've been a client of big law in my GC role. So I look at it from that perspective. I think you make a really important point that the prospects to advance to equity partnership are just tough across the board. They're tough for everybody, but they are tougher for certain segments. And I think that women of color, are particularly women of any color, are that intersectionality of diversity that really gets sort of lost in that shuffle sometimes. And AAPIs, as we've already talked about, I think are hampered by the implicit biases that are helpful when you're entry level, but harmful when you're trying to advance. I think that for somebody who's really trying to succeed and stick with it, it's important to think about sponsorship, not just mentorship. We all need mentors, but sponsorship, which is a person who will advocate for you, take you to important meetings, speak well of you behind your back, and bring you to the attention of others in the firm. So developing sponsors is important, and developing relationships with clients. Even if you're just a team member and you're never going to be the engagement partner, it's still important to have those client relationships. And I've always encouraged people to look at the people in the client tier who are peers, right? So, if you're an associate, you're not going to be dealing directly with the general counsel, but you might be dealing directly with an associate general counsel or a deputy controller in the finance group. Whatever that relationship is, you need to nurture it, because those people will advance as a client, and they can help to sponsor you as the law firm attorney. So I think building a book of business is one of the key metrics.
Ruthe, I have a question for you, and I'm going to build off of a question that's in the chat here. So you've worked a lot on pathways into the legal profession, especially for Asian Americans and other underrepresented groups. I showed some of the numbers about the drop-off in terms of people going to law school. One of the things that the data also reveal, I mentioned it, is that Asian Americans, when asked about their motivations for attending law school, don't identify politics, government, or activism as great a rate as other groups. And since the title of this panel is about the model minority myth, there is a problem with the model. There are many problems with the model minority stereotype, one of which is that the perception of being a model minority is very limiting. It's essentially, be the worker bee, keep your head down, don't complain, do the work, and basically serve others. And I think that the question is, when Asian Americans then speak up and speak out on civil rights, political activism, do they face other kinds of headwinds because they are going against type, and that they will implicitly be punished for doing so? How should Asian American attorneys think about that? And that's especially important question, I think, in the current moment that we're in.
That's a really interesting question. And I've thought about it a lot because I think that there's a huge difference in generations. My generation was
Mhm.
more the model minority, to keep your head down and work and do a good job and you will be elevated. We were not as political, in my view, although some may differ with me. I don't think we were as political as the baby boomers and moving on into the next generation. What I'm very hopeful and gratified about is that I see that changing. I see especially the students that I work with in high school and community college not afraid to speak up, not afraid to be heard, not afraid to be the voice at the table. And then I see the generations of your children and my grandchildren having the kind of voice that I never would have at their age, and speaking up and being the kind of uh, really vocal advocate at a very young age that I wish that I had been at that age. So to answer that is not a simple question. I think it changes with the generations, and it has been changing with the generations. I'd be interested in hearing, Wendy and I are sort of the same generation, but you're kind of a generation behind us, and hearing what you have to say about that model minority and if it's really true for you and your colleagues, because I think it has been for us, but it is changing, and as each generation comes up, it is definitely changing a lot.
That's really interesting perspective. I've heard many different kinds of things. There is a generation of Asian American lawyers that, especially the early ones, who came of age as a result of the civil rights movement. Dale Manami reminds me of this often, and his generation of lawyers kind of, they look at the model minority stereotype and think, gosh, that's so anomalous. That was never us. We were
Yeah.
we were basically out there advocating and being active on all kinds of political issues because that's what drew us to the law. I think there's been generational shifts, and there, in the period that I highlight in the graph where Asian Americans really, went to law school, I think it's fair to say there's a mix. There certainly is a strain of careerism, just general careerism among Asian Americans. If you ask questions, we know from the AJ, after the JD study, if you ask questions about things like financial security and prospect of making a good life, Asian Americans rank those kind of factors very high compared to other groups. So I think there is a mix, but I think the model minority issue persists in the sense that so many of the comments we heard in focus groups and such and survey results were that Asian Americans, one of the barriers to advancement is they're not perceived as leadership material. And what does it mean to be perceived as leadership material in our profession? Well, we happen to inhabit a very vocal profession, a very verbal profession, a profession in which assertiveness, ability to kind of the intangible gravitas that people talk about, these things are prized. And Asian Americans are not perceived as having those qualities. In our, query, as Wendy's example gave us, whether this is really objective perception or whether these are, pre-existing stereotypes. But the point is, I'll give you one quote that kind of summarizes this for me. In one of our focus groups, one of the attorneys who was an associate said, "I always seem to be the person staying back to cover the assignments while my colleagues are out having yoga and wine." Staying back to cover the assignments, that's sort of the role that we're relegated as the model minority. The yoga and the wine, that's where the relationships are made. That's where, people get to know one another personally and become personally invested in one another. And so I always tell, young attorneys that go for the yoga and the wine. Don't be the one staying back to cover the assignments. And I think this is even more urgent today in light of what we have seen with respect to anti-Asian discrimination and even violence, because that set of issues, in my view, has been a current throughout American history, but it is largely invisible. And it's invisible in our educations. It's invisible in the media coverage that we see. Only until recently, of course, do we see this sort of spate of articles. And I think the role of Asian American lawyers has to be, in part, to speak up about this, because if we're not the ones to do it, I'm not sure who else it's going to be. So these are all things that are uncomfortable because they go against type. I worry that the model minority stereotype is not just something people have imposed from the outside, but then it's something that many in our community, myself included, sort of internalize, as what we are supposed to be like. And so we just have to be vigilant about this, especially in the current environment, and not be afraid to go against type and to speak up on behalf of our community. That's a longer-winded answer than I intended. Wendy, do you have anything to add?
Well, of course, I always agree with the points that you've made. The one thing I wanted to note, because it's interesting in the Q&A that people are concerned about our role in more activist organizations. I used to say that I really didn't discover I was Asian until I got my clerkship, moved to San Francisco, and was suddenly in a very diverse community and met people like Dale Manami. And I said, oh my gosh, there's a whole world out here, of which I was completely ignorant and naive as a Midwesterner and also going to school on the East Coast. And I went through a period where, I had a lot of trouble with guilt, thinking, the Asian Law Caucus, these people, the firebrands in the 70s, who were out there almost, fists in the air, were doing such amazing things. And here I was, pursuing this sort of very traditional route, going from clerkship to big law, ultimately into corporate America. But I realized that, we have to be present. I've always said that, NAPABA is my home. Ruthe and I are both past presidents, but we're also very active in the ABA, because if we're not at the table in mainstream organizations, then we don't have influence. And I think the same is true with respect to social justice issues. So while you could be working full-time at a wonderful public interest firm and at your day job, you could also be a key influencer within majority-owned law firms and corporate America if you're the one who's willing to speak up on DEI issues, social justice, and, as I said, be an influencer within a mainstream organization, and not insignificantly direct dollars, direct foundation dollars into those important causes. So I think it's possible to achieve, to do your part in advancing social justice for our community without necessarily doing that full time.
Okay, on that hopeful note, I'm going to close this out because we are past the appointed time. There are many other great observations in the chat and in the Q&As. We can't get to them all, but thank you all so much for joining this panel. And I want to thank Wendy and Ruthe especially for lending us tremendous insight from your many, many years of experience in the profession and the many roles that you have played. That's really essential. That we have leaders like you. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We can continue. Many of us are networked in many ways, so let's continue the conversation offline. Have a great day.
Thank you.